On the road through America's heartland, U.S. nuns protest against proposed Republican budget cuts they say will leave millions of the country's poor even more vulnerable. What is the role of the Catholic Church in U.S. politics? You're watching Inside Story U.S. 2012 from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Ratansi. A group of nuns is traveling through 9 states, making stops at homeless shelters, schools and healthcare facilities where their sisters help the poor and marginalized. The goal is to draw attention to the Republican budget plan, which they say will harm those that they work to help. The man behind the budget, Wisconsin Congressman Paul Ryan, who is himself Catholic, disagrees. He says it was precisely his religious principles that inspired his plan. He argues it will help the poor by making them less reliant on government. But as the nuns seek to bring attention to the plight of the poor, other Catholic leaders in the US, many who also oppose the Ryan budget, say the focus of Catholics should instead be on President Barack Obama's overhaul of the US healthcare system, the Affordable Care Act. They want hospitals and schools run by the church to be exempt from a requirement that health insurance plans cover contraceptive services. Those bishops and many other Catholics oppose birth control, and some have gone as far as saying the healthcare law constitutes a war on religion. The Vatican has criticized the nuns for focusing too much on economic injustice and not enough on the church's other social teachings. But the nuns say the controversy has only served to help them promote their cause, as Kristen Salumi reports.
It's a trip that's turning heads in the American heartland. The passengers stepping off of the bus and into the spotlight, a group of sisters in trouble with the Vatican for, of all things, focusing too much on the plight of the poor.
And we get food items ready for them.
Like those served at this food pantry in Dubuque, Iowa. Even though the nuns were stung by the criticism from Rome, they decided to stay the course. In fact, they say the firestorm has given them a platform.
When we got named, I mean, there was like an explosion of support. So when we had all of this opportunity, all of this exposure, all of this attention, nuns aren't used to having a lot of attention on themselves. And so it was like, oh my gosh, we need to use this for the sake of people at the margins.
Poor people, they say, could lose out even more in the political battle over the country's debt.
The nuns have just arrived in Janesville, Wisconsin. The whole point of this tour is to target Republican lawmakers who voted in favor of the proposed cuts, which will devastate social programs. This is the home office of Paul Ryan, the congressman who authored that plan.
Thank you! Thank you!
The nuns delivered an alternative budget that favors a safety net for the worst off instead of tax cuts for the rich. Though Ryan wasn't there to receive it, a huge crowd of supporters were.
How can you take away food from the poor? How can you take away health care for the elderly? He's going against every Catholic principle there is.
I'm very supportive of the nuns and what they're doing. There's a heavy element of social justice in the Catholic tradition, which I highly respect.
Of course, not all Catholics agree with the sisters.
Well, I think that partisan politics is really, in Catholic thought, the domain of the laity. So it just really kind of strikes me as inappropriate.
Ryan, who's been campaigning on a pledge to cut, issued a statement saying the social programs in fact hinder people's chances to move up in society.
We're not giving up.
But the nuns remain hopeful of a compromise.
Democracy requires us to be able to talk to each other about difference. Right now, in a political year, they'd rather have sound bites and fights. So my idea of peace and harmony and talking to each other might not get you in my bus, but it really is an important piece to bridge the divide.
Until then, there's every sign they'll continue to take their gospel on the road, with or without the Vatican's blessing. Kristen Salumi, Al Jazeera, Janesville, Wisconsin.
So what should Catholic leaders in the US focus on? To discuss this, we're joined by Stephen White. He's a fellow in the Catholic Studies program at the Ethics and Policy Center. We also have John Gehring, the Catholic program director of the group Faith in Public Life. And we're joined by Sister Marie Lucey. She's the Associate Director of the Franciscan Action Network, a grassroots, faith-based civic engagement organization. Sister Marie, why is the Republican budget proposal a matter for religious organizations like those of the American Nuns?
Yeah, I would call it the House budget rather than the Republican budget, I suppose, the House budget, because it would be very, very harmful to people who really need assistance. It would cut food stamps, for one thing. It would
actually, you know what I might do? We do have some of the key points of the Ryan plan, which I can actually itemize, and then perhaps we can get the significance, the wider social significance of some of these issues. Ryan saying he wanted his budget proposal to sharpen the contrast with Barack Obama on debt, and here are some of those key points. It aims to reduce the deficit by cutting spending on everything except defense. It mandates the reduction of all government spending to 3.75% of GDP by 2050. According to Politico, about half of the budget's $2.5 trillion in 10-year savings would come from cutting healthcare programs, in addition to nutrition and education programs that benefit working-class families. Food stamp assistance, which we were just beginning to hear about, would be cut by around $133 billion. Assistance for low-income college students would be cut by $94 billion. Ryan's proposal also preserves Bush-era tax cuts and lowers the corporate tax rate. So those are the details then. And so you feel that there's something innately, I mean, there's something, that morality somehow becomes part of this issue then, perhaps?
Yes, we really view a budget, whether it's federal budget or state budget, as a moral document. Because a budget really reflects the values and the priorities of a country or of a state. So we believe in what we call a faithful budget. Many of us from the faith community, Christian, Muslim, and Jewish communities, have been working for months on what we call a faithful budget, and that which would serve the common good and protect especially the most vulnerable people in society. And our concern about the House budget that was passed is that it will be very detrimental, especially to those who are on the edges of society, who are struggling families now just trying to keep afloat, and it would shred the safety net. So we're extremely concerned about the negative impact.
Stephen White, it's an interesting argument that effectively means that the trickle-down economics of the sort that Ryan and others advocate is inherently immoral, because certainly in this case, for example, it is literally taking the poor's access to food away from them.
Well, I think there's 2 points that I would make. The first is that at the heart of the Ryan budget is entitlement reform. That's the heart and soul of the House budget. And the reason that entitlement reform is so important is...
And by entitlement we mean, of course, the social safety net that allows health care for the elderly, as well as retirement benefits. And
Precisely. Primarily health entitlements. Those are the real drivers of the long-term debt in the United States. So reforming those entitlement programs is necessary because it's hard to have a safety net for the American people, especially the people on the margins, if the nation is insolvent. So the idea is that you get the long-term debt under control so that you can continue to provide necessary services, especially for those who are on the margins.
All right, I mean, actually, we can hear from Paul Ryan himself, his defense of his budget. In fact, he actually argues that it was his faith that informed his budget proposal. Here's what he had to say.
To me, using my Catholic faith, we call it the social magisterium, which is how do you apply the doctrine of your teaching into your everyday life as a lay person? To me, the principle of subsidiarity, which is really federalism, meaning government closest to the people governs best. Having a civil society of the principle of solidarity, where we, through our civic organizations, through our churches, through our charities, through all of our different groups where we interact with people as a community, that's how we advance the common good, by not having big government crowd out civil society, but by having enough space in our communities so that we can interact with each other and take care of people who are down and out in our communities. Those principles are very, very important. And the preferential option for the poor, which is one of the primary tenets of Catholic social teaching, means don't keep people poor, don't make people dependent on government so that they stay stuck in their station in life. Help people get out of poverty onto life of independence.
Now, this argument from Paul Ryan that seized on a Catholic concept of subsidiarity received a pretty furious response from several quarters, including nearly 90 Georgetown University faculty and administrators. They sent an open letter to him detailing their objections. They say, we would be remiss in our duty to you and our students if we did not challenge your continuing misuse of Catholic teaching to defend a budget plan that decimates food programs for struggling families, radically weakens protections for the elderly and sick, and gives more tax breaks to the wealthiest few. In short, your budget appears to reflect the values of your favorite philosopher, Ayn Rand, rather than the gospel of Jesus Christ. Her call to selfishness and her antagonism toward religion are antithetical to the gospel values of compassion and love. John Gehring, I suppose clearly Paul Ryan and others then are trying to use this term subsidiarity, which you might have to explain then, as an example, as almost a religious affirmation of small government. I mean, is that basically the basis there?
Well, I think there's a significant concern that Republicans and conservatives have misused and really distorted the understanding of subsidiarity. Certainly that those sources closest to the challenges that people face, families, churches, have a unique responsibility to help those who are struggling. But our Catholic social justice tradition also talks about the concept of solidarity, which is when those particular sources closest to the problem can't pick up that need, and for example, charities and churches are strained to the breaking point already.
Right. So we should be very clear. That's what subsidiarity means. Then it's the people closest to the most local level sorting out their problems before you go to central government or anywhere else. Right.
Correct.
Right. Okay. But so there is this twin concept of solidarity, which perhaps the argument is Paul Ryan isn't so keen on.
Well, what I would like to say is you were the one who mentioned the gospel. Paul Ryan did not. And we are very much in accord with the U.S. Catholic bishops in opposition to this budget because it is contradictory not only to Catholic social teaching, but to the gospel. And the gospel clearly makes it that we must be concerned about everyone and have particular concern about those who are poor, those who are most vulnerable, those who are most in need.
Right, but clearly Ryan is making the argument that he is concerned about that, but this is all about their long-term benefits, even if in the short term it seems
I don't know any poor people who want to be reliant on the government. What they want to do is self-sufficient, like Representative Ryan would say. But how do they get there? How do they get there? They need education, they need jobs, and they need assistance to move them out of poverty. And that's what a faithful budget should do, to help to move people out of poverty so that they can no longer be dependent on government programs.
What seems to be really quite fascinating, Stephen, is that the church hierarchy doesn't seem to be wanting to push this particular argument forward. They seem much keener than on this issue of President Obama's healthcare reform. And some of the language we're hearing about the healthcare reform has some of that passion that we're hearing from Sister Marie and some of the nuns about trickle-down economics and trying to cut the deficit first before anything else. In fact, we have one letter that was read out by Catholic bishops and priests across the U.S. on January 29th protesting against President Obama's refusal to exempt church-affiliated non-profit organizations from offering contraceptive coverage to their employees. And it's very strong language. Quote, we will not comply with this unjust law. People of faith cannot be made second-class citizens. We're already joined by our brothers and sisters of all faiths and many others of goodwill in this important effort to regain our religious freedom. In generations past, the Church has always been able to count on the faithful to stand up and protect her sacred rights and duties. I hope and trust she can count on this generation of Catholics to do the same. Stephen White, I mean, the language then and the battle that the church hierarchy has chosen, isn't that of ensuring that the marginalized aren't forgotten in this craze for deficit control? It is about this issue of the healthcare reform. What's behind this sort of language about a war on religion even?
Well, I don't think first of all, I don't think it's an either or. I don't think it's a question of either you're going to focus on religious liberty or you're going to talk about helping the poor and the marginalized. I think it's clearly a both and. As for the religious liberty question, the bishops are primarily concerned about first of all, they were largely in favor of healthcare reform. This is something that the bishops have been pushing for since the early 20th century. I think almost everybody agrees that our current healthcare system, or at least the way it was before Obamacare, is broken, isn't working, needs to be fixed. That was the whole impetus behind the Affordable Care Act. What sort of stuck with the bishops and what kept them from endorsing the Affordable Care Act was provisions about the funding for objectionable services, particularly funding for abortion. There was some disagreement about whether the Affordable Care Act would cover abortion.
Right, but they were talking about contraception actually here as well.
This is with the original Affordable Care Act.
Moving forward,
the conscience clause, the conscience question didn't really come up until much more recently. Once Health and Human Services started filling out the bones of this legislation. So the contraception mandate is not in the 2,000+ page bill itself. That's been promulgated since then by the Health and Human Services Department. So the bishops wanted healthcare reform. There was a sticking point on whether this was going to fund abortion.
Right. And the administration thinks it's made some accommodations, and therefore...
Well, they didn't get the language they wanted on the Affordable Care Act, so the bishops didn't support it. Others did, Catholic Health Association, for example. Since then, the HHS mandate, which fills out how preventive services are going to be distributed, or what kind of preventive services are going to be required by health insurance, that mandate includes, this includes the abortifacient drugs, the contraceptive drugs, and sterilization.
It will be the responsibility of insurance companies, basically, to pay for it.
First, it was going to be the insurance provider. Right. Then the accommodation that was promised but was not promulgated with the original rule changed it to be the insurance company pays for it. Well, a lot of Catholic institutions are their own insurance company. So you're telling some Catholic institutions that you don't have to pay for this, someone else will pay for it. Well, they are that someone else in a lot of cases. But the biggest sticking point for the bishops on the health care, if I can go a little bit longer, is that the mandate includes a 4-part test for who qualifies as a religious institution and who doesn't for purposes of exemption. And it's an extremely narrow definition of what qualifies as a religious institution.
And we'll leave that there for that particular discussion. But John Gehring there, I mean, is it a both and issue then for the church hierarchy? We have this fortnight of protests now being organised by the bishops on this issue. We're not seeing so much opposition then to the issues of the poor being left out of any future budget proposals. The church, that's leaving the church hierarchy open to the charge of being, in some ways, actually using the rhetoric of the Republican Party's attack on President Obama, while ignoring perhaps the social issues, which some argue should be their main concern.
I think that's a real concern. I mean, bishops historically have been above the partisan fray, and I think right now what concerns many Catholics who respect our bishops, respect the church, and want to see our church leaders, having a vital role in our public debates, is that they're at the very least giving the impression that they're comfortable being aligned with a conservative political ideology just a few months before the election. And you've had a vocal minority of bishops who have used some inflammatory rhetoric. For example, in Illinois, a bishop compared the Obama administration to the days of Hitler and Stalin. Another bishop used the word despotism. And so, when you have that kind of language, Republicans are certainly going to use that, and it's an election year, and cooler heads are not going to prevail. And I think the concern is that, bishops need to be careful when the impression they are giving is that they're tipping the political scales on one side or the other.
Sister Marie, would you agree then that there is a slight difference in emphasis from the church hierarchy then?
Currently, at this moment, there is. But I also know that the bishops, the Catholic Health Association, all have been working very hard to provide affordable health care for all. And that's the key thing. I really regret what's happening right now, and I truly hope that can be worked out, because I think for the U.S. Conference Bishops, Catholic Health Association, all of us, what we want is to be able to provide accessible health care to 32 million people. And that was what we were working for.
But is there an equivalence between these two issues then? When we start talking about religious liberty, clearly this becomes very knotty. Who decides when these are valid claims of religious liberty being affected by government legislation? And clearly the government has decided, well, look, a majority of Catholic women use contraception. There's scientific evidence that shows it's a crucial component of female reproductive health. It actually decreases the number of abortions in the long run. And anyway, these issues of contraception and abortion will probably be sorted out by the Supreme Court at some point. Whereas a wholesale attack on the poor in favor of the rich as it's conceived, actively removing access to food for the poor, well, that is something that the church should be mobilizing about, and that is something very much in their remit as opposed to that other issue.
Yeah, well, I think there's 2 points. First of all, one of the reasons they're focusing on religious liberty is that this is an issue that's in play politically. The House budget has as much chance of becoming law as I have of being elected president in November. It's not going to happen.
But these are principles that then gain currency, and in fact, many Democrats have seem to be taking the framework of their own budget for their own.
So the first question is a point of emphasis. Why are you focusing on one issue now as opposed to another one? But as for speaking the principles that apply to each case, the Catholic Church is very clear on that we all have an obligation to help the least among us. We call it the preferential option for the poor. It's very clear that the state has an important and good role to play in how we order our society and in promoting solidarity and helping organize institutions, okay?
Right.
It doesn't have a clear position on whether Medicare should grow at 5% or 8%. I mean, it simply doesn't have a position on that. And people of goodwill can and do disagree about that. And it doesn't mean that nobody's right or nobody's wrong. It just means that there's no clear
fundamental
teaching.
Principles there of that social teaching which are at stake, Sister Marie. Then
yes. And on the freedom, hospitals have always, Catholic hospitals have always had that conscience clause, that freedom. It's applicable to the hospitals. What we're getting into now is what Stephen described before. It plays out in how insurance, has it. So this is where I hope it.
But is that also that wider context once again, John, as to, I mean, what are the priorities? When the Vatican says the nuns are concentrating too much on social issues, I mean, how are we supposed to interpret that at the expense of issues of abortion or contraception? Is there a hierarchy of apostolic work or something that we don't know about? I mean, is this? I mean, or is it something that we should be looking at very carefully?
Well, I want to go back to something that Stephen said. He said that the Ryan budget has very little chance of passing, and that's correct. However, Mitt Romney has endorsed the principles of this budget. It's become a template for the conservative economic agenda that really is anathema to Catholic social justice principles in terms of our commitment to the poor. And so that's why it's a debate right now. And I think it's a very serious issue when a Catholic member of Congress, not simply Paul Ryan, but John Boehner, the Speaker of the House, is touting a budget that eviscerates social safety nets and it's making
we're running out of time. What about this issue, though, of the Vatican then saying to the nuns, look, hang on, you're less of the social stuff, please? What are we supposed to make of that?
Can I respond to that too? From our beginnings, like the sisters, from the time we were founded, it was to serve the neediest in society. That's how we began. And we did it in schools and hospitals and social services. Now, we are looking at the root causes and what keeps people poor, so we have been engaged in systemic change. Rather than just works of charity, also addressing systemic change.
So again, how do we interpret the Vatican? I mean, it's no secret that this Pope in particular is no fan of liberation theology and empowerment through Jesus's teachings and so forth. Is this, again, does he want a bit of a fight perhaps? Because he's made no secret as well that he doesn't mind a smaller church, and it's no secret that many who support this Pope are looking at the progressive wing of the church when they say that maybe it's time to winnow out.
I don't know that he wants a smaller church. He did say that at one point that may be the future of the church, but I would be very doubtful that that's what he wants. And again, I think this goes back to a question of both and. The issues we're talking about here aren't exactly related. The Vatican doctrinal assessments of the Leadership Conference of Women Religious is not directly related to
accusations of a feminist agenda and so forth.
Yeah, the idea is that the truths of the Catholic faith inform everything we do, as I think Sister would agree, and John, that the reason that we help the poor is because that's what flows from our faith. Okay, but at the same time, you can't have. Can't do, faith isn't enough, you have to have works. You also have to what you believe and what you profess matters. So the Vatican in its doctrinal assessment was looking at some issues of doctrine. They weren't saying you're doing too much social work. Everyone says that. That's not true. That's not what the Vatican said. What they said was, we applaud you for the great work you're doing. Here are some points of doctrine that we think need to be addressed, and here are some points of social work and social justice issues that we think you can do a better job.
We only have 30 seconds left. John Gehring and then Sister Marie. John Gehring, your response to that?
Well, look, the sisters responded, I thought, very eloquently a few weeks ago. The Leadership Conference of Women Religious said that this investigation seemed not transparent. It was unfair. They want to continue in dialogue, but they will not back down from their social justice mission. And I think it does give, you asked about the impression, I think it gives the impression that the Catholic Church is cracking down on nuns who really live out the gospel every day. And I think that is a sad and troubling thing for many Catholics.
Sister Marie, is that the perception that you have?
I just want to say that the Leadership Conference of Women Religious has never opposed Catholic Church teaching.
Sister Marie Lucey, thank you very much. John Gehring, thank you very much. Stephen White, thank you. That's all from the team in Washington, D.C. for now. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook, where you can find more information about the program. And we want to hear from you. Tell us what stories you think we should be covering. Send your ideas directly to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net.